Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Corey Gumbs, and welcome to our special live stream where we're going to be speaking with Gabriel Soto of Edison Research. Today, we're going to be discussing or answering your questions and having him answer some questions about the Black Podcast Listener Report 2.0 from Edison Research, XM Media, and Mindshare. Today, we have Gabriel Soto and Talib Jasir from Afros Audio. I guess I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, and then we'll get started. So
Gabriel,
we'll
you
start with you,
first.
Talib. Huh?
Okay,
Myself?
I was saying Gabriel is our guest, so he
Okay. Yeah, Gabriel first. Gabriel's
yeah.
the guest, you're right.
No, I appreciate that. Well, thanks for having me here, Talib and Corey. I'm happy to be here in front of this wonderful community, and excited to see what you guys are building here. But yeah, my name is Gabriel Soto. I'm a senior director at Edison Research. I do a lot of research in the audio space, not just podcasting. We work a lot with radio companies, podcasting companies, audiobooks, and we measure at Edison the entire space. So I'm primarily one of the authors of the Black Podcast Listener Report, and the audience measured and asked questions to this audience about what type of podcasts they listen to, if they listen to podcasts at all, and their different behaviors. And that all came out last week. I'm sure many of you saw it, and I'm happy to talk about it more today.
Awesome. And my name is Talib Jasir. I'm the founder and CEO of the Afros Audio Podcast Festival. Now in our fifth year. Next conference is October 21st, 22nd in Baltimore, Maryland. And I'm happy to be here and present this information and allow it to come straight from Gabriel himself on some of the questions that the community have and also myself.
Well, thank you guys for being here. I know we worked hard on this, Talib, and we put out a call to people in our communities to send in their questions. So I think my first question is for those people who are learning about this actual report for the first time. Gabriel, can you just give us some background on how it started, when it started, and what was the purpose?
Yeah, of course. So Edison has been in the podcasting space since 2006. That's when we first started measuring if people had even heard about a podcast, right? And year after year, we became one of the leaders in podcasting research, just trying to understand what the audience does, how they consume the medium, and how fast they're adopting it. And we measured the growth and the boom of podcasting that we've seen in recent years. As part of that, we've branched out into different studies like the Podcast Consumer Report, subscriber studies that clients have access to when they do subscribe to our products, such as Edison Podcast Metrics. And we started a report that was called the Latino Podcast Listener Report. And we saw that, for me, it has always been a passion. I always believe that media was a way to almost humanize and spotlight different groups of people, not just in podcasting, right, but on TV. I always wondered why some groups were, living in these like financial gaps where Latinos and Black Americans didn't make it. We don't make as much money as our white counterparts, right? We have a lot of obstacles that we have to face. And for me, the media has always been, I think, this catalyst that I think if we told our stories better, like our own stories, and helped our own community through these mediums, then we can make it, close that gap a little bit faster, right? So that was always one of my passions. I always loved this idea of analyzing and looking into diverse audiences. So I decided to take the skill set that we have at Edison and the different resources on podcast listening and combine that with a little bit of my passion to do research and provide and advocate data for the Latino community, the Black community, and other communities. So it started with the Latino Podcast Listener Report, and we managed to bring on a sponsor for the Black Podcast Listener Report, and SXM Media. They were one of the sponsors of the Latino Report. So They saw the value, they saw what it could do, and they were very happy to join and partner with us along with Mindshare.
That's awesome.
All right, thank you for that. Talib, how do you want to do this? You have some question you want to start with, or do you want me to just jump right into the questions
It's
that
well, let me jump in with the first question. I know this is one of our questions from one of our community members as well, Shamiko. And one of the question is, and I'll read the line that's in the report for us to ask this question. But in the Edison report, it says 2,500 people age 18 plus in the U.S. Who self-identify as Black African American were interviewed in online surveys in September of 2022. The data was weighted to match age, sex, census, region of U.S. Black population, and infinite dial 22 podcast listening statistics. So how did you all arrive at the number and the people that do get surveyed? And should we expect this to kind of remain the same, or will it expand each year?
That's a really great question. Sample size is everything when it comes to survey research. To measure a population that represents 12% of the country, you need a strong sample size to be able to drill down and look at this data by women and men. Industry standard has become, around the 1,000, 1,200 to 1,500 mark. And by interviewing 2,500 Black respondents, we're able to capture about 1,200 to 1,500 of those that are podcast listeners, and the rest are non-podcast listeners, or have listened but no longer listen. So it allows us to look at both groups. Although we didn't put out a lot of information on non-listeners in this report, we're able to compare the demographics, right? We're able to compare different attitudes that they have. We know with this information that Black podcast listeners are more likely to be employed, to have a higher education. So that's how we decide on a sample size. And generally, rule of thumb in the industry, a sample size of around 1,200 to 1,500 is good, and it allows us to be confident in the data that we put out there, in those percentages, in those actual numbers, to say that those are pretty good estimates, right? We can also look at sample sizes of 500, maybe even 200. We won't go under 100 people. That's why we've been cutting up that data by age, by gender. If you look at a certain age group, that lowers the sample size to about 200, right? If you want to look at a smaller bracket. And in that case, when you look at those numbers, we believe in the estimates, but they're more likely to change, right, if we conducted a survey next year. So sample size of 1,500 listeners and 1,000 non-podcast listeners is a good and a strong enough sample size. To your question about whether that might change, if we find that there is a need to, if maybe for one thing we're thinking about, for example, in this next report, maybe non-listeners isn't such an important topic as it once was 2 years ago or this year. We might increase the sample size on podcast listeners to drill down on something a little bit more granular, but we might get rid of the non-listeners to help with the costs of the survey. So in that case, we would change the sample size, but we can adjust depending on what our goals are, what we want to find out, and how times change, right? How the industry changes and what the industry needs.
Okay.
I think that this will be a great segue into the next question around, I guess, the control group or whatever you call the group. This is from Carrie Ann Reed Brown of Breadfruit Media. It's a multi-part. I don't know. I have a feeling like all these questions we probably take up the whole time discussing it. So I'm gonna ask you a couple of questions, but she's very big in the Caribbean space, and as you know, there's a lot of Caribbeans here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
From different parts of the Caribbean. She says here, according to recent Pew Research study, 1 in 10 Black people are immigrants. So the first part
Mhm.
of this question I want to ask is, how does Edison Research and the podcast industry generally plan to capture listening habits of this growing population, or is that in your plan?
No, that so the Caribbean population is something that we definitely look at. The immigrant population, we want to make sure we capture a significant size that's representative of the Black population. So that Pew Research number is something that we looked at when we were recruiting for this survey. So although we didn't show any data by that group, I think we can in the future. They are represented and were recruited um, within the bigger and a larger group. So when we recruit for this survey, we take a look at that information. We take a look at make sure that men and women are also represented within the group. We take a look at census region and make sure we don't collect too many responses from the East, right? Because we want to capture a representative group of the entire nation. Same thing with age, same thing with employment, same thing with education. So we look at those key demographics to make sure all of those groups are represented within these Black respondents.
All right. There's two more questions to this, and then we'll move on to the next one. Can we expect this report to capture the nuances across Black podcasting, the way that the Latino podcasting report captures those born in the U.S. and outside, or first gen, second gen?
Yeah, so that's I think one thing that will require a stronger sample size. So if that's something that we do want to look at, we would have to, to work out the costs, do away with that non-listener group, and maybe recruit a stronger sample size, or maybe oversample for that immigrant population. Um, in the Latino podcast listener report, there's just so many that are part of that first generation, second generation group that allows us to capture that sample naturally. But for us, in this case, in the Black listeners report, we would have to focus in on it and control for that, which is possible. It's just a little bit more expensive to do.
Okay. And the last part of this question, this part of these questions is, why should we care about this report when it doesn't accurately capture the diversity of creators or their audience, or that most advertisers still prefer the download metric?
Well, I think the report reveals a lot of information on listening behavior. Um, I don't know what they mean by it doesn't capture the diversity. If they're talking about the different age groups, the different.
I think more like, you have the African American population, African, the Caribbean portion. Those all have different audiences, different. They intermingle with each other, but then they also have very separate cultural audiences and topics and interests.
Yeah. Okay. Um, yeah, you can't take a look at that information in this study. Like I said, we'll need a stronger sample size, but it still reveals a lot of the entire collective, right, of Black listeners. I think people have seen the report, and it provides a lot of visibility and momentum for the collective as a group. And in the future, the more conversations that we have about the Black Podcast Listener Report, the more, I guess, ideas that can come out of it, like looking at it by these diverse groups, right? The Caribbean group, the like from the African diaspora, immigrant groups, those who are first generation. It's gotten a conversation started, and it's something that, if this information is presented to different stakeholders or the industry might get wind of this and say, hey, we want to look at the information by these Caribbean groups, these different groups. Why don't we do it? And it brings this momentum and allows us to make it happen. It gives us a stronger possibility of doing it and finding the funding to do the report. But overall, I think both this report and other reports that we put out are certainly helpful in helping those with this audience advocate for themselves. right? Adding value to why Black listeners are so important that we shouldn't forget about them, that we should capitalize on this opportunity because these listeners are hungry for more content and they add a lot of value to the space.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
You have a question, Talib?
Yeah, sure. So, just like anything, information is when it's applied can be a powerful tool, right? And so, what would be your advice for podcasters who have this report, who understand it, and how to use this data to their advantage? What would your advice be for them?
I think it depends on what your goals are, right? I think you should sit down and think about your goals. If you're selling to an advertiser, then take this report and run with it, right? If your audience is a predominantly Black audience, then you can advocate for that group with these data that you see in the report, such as Black listeners are more likely to have purchased the product. They're more likely to have considered a product. They're more likely to have recommended a product from hearing it on a podcast advertising than the general population, than the general podcast listening audience. And that means something, right? You have hard data that really says that Black listeners are more likely to engage with a brand than the general audience. And they're even more likely to engage with that brand if it's coming from an advertisement from a Black host. And that, if you are a Black host, if you're a Black creator, that's also data that advocates for you. So stick it into your sales pitch. And if you're collecting revenue that way through advertisements, that's something that you want to put in there. Also strategy, right? If you are a network, for example, taking a look at how the consumption of different podcasts has changed year over year. We've seen a stronger consumption this year on like video games, not personalities, personal development, sports, even. It allows you to think of what type of content you might want to create next to appeal to these listeners, and it tells you a little something about how this audience is changing, how this audience is maturing year over year as the times change.
That's good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Corey, you have a question?
Yeah, we'll go back to the list. Excuse me. So this question is from Dee Dee Harrison. She's a member of the Black Podcast Association. She states, this report shows that Black audiences will listen to more of us if they knew who and where we are. How can we use this information to go about changing it, and what will help us become more visible? Is there a way that this report can help with that, solve that problem?
Yeah. So I think, advocacy groups or any efforts that are out there right now that are trying to advocate for more creators, Black creators in the space, will certainly use this report to do that. And, there's groups out there like BIPOC creators, your organization, I think, that advocate for these groups and these creators in this space. So take the data and tell Spotify, right, how important and how much value there is in this connection between a Black listener and a Black host, and advocate and say, we need to be spotlit more. We need to be in the ears and eyes in front of people when they open up this app in the user interface, so we can be found more easily, right? This is not only good for us, it's good for you if you want Black listeners to be on your app, to use your app, and if you want the podcast industry to grow, right? Find a way to grow the industry for other people while benefiting yourself too. Because Spotify and these other applications, these other directories have an incentive, right, to grow the industry because they're investing a lot of money into the industry. And by using this data, these hard numbers, you'll be able to get one step closer to persuading them to highlight this sort of content in your content?
Yeah, I just want to know. I know discoverability is always just an industry wide problem, but even more specifically, makes it a little more complicated for people of color. Considering. But I do like the advocacy part. Using this to advocate and go into to the bigger distributors as well. Um, to I guess the advertising side too helps also because that's a lot of their models based off of that. So
Yes,
um,
exactly. Yep.
thank you for that. I think the next question we have from Stephanie Shaw. Uh, I don't know if this is within the scope of what you guys do, but can you provide data around what Black women ages 35 plus are looking for in a health and wellness podcast? And also, what health and wellness podcasts are these women listening to? Um, I know you guys deal with the listener side, but you don't really go that granular, right? With asking about specific podcasts.
We have information, and here I can take a look at it here from our Edison podcast metrics survey. And I can tell you the top shows that are best at reaching women. And it was a 35 plus group.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Black
let's
women
take a look.
35 plus, health and wellness.
Okay. And that, although I don't know if we'll be able to get that deep into health and wellness, I at least can provide some insight um, as to what shows are the most efficient at catering or appealing to Black women. Let me see if I can take a look here. But that's also something that we can certainly capture in a survey, right? What late, like next year, for example, we can ask, if you do listen to health and wellness, what are the topics that interest you most? We did ask a question about let's see, it was specific topics in terms of the content, and you can kind of, to get a little bit of insight into her question, um, we can look at the differences between women and men. And that's not something I have in front of me, but just in general, among the Black listening audience as a whole, self-care, racial injustice cases, and celebrity news. Let's see what else here. Um, Financial mindfulness, not so much health and wellness, um, but it seems that self-care, yes, and social racial injustices were some of the two topics. So it's probably where that question stemmed from, right? What specifically in self-care? Um, and that's something that we can do further research on next year when we ask about self-care topics. What interests you? What specifically do you want to see in a podcast? So I know that doesn't answer her question directly, but it's good input for next year's report. Now let me just take a look at Black women and our efficiency. Let's see some of the top shows that are. So one of the top shows, for example, in terms of reaching women, Black women, you have the Steve Harvey morning show, just to give an example. And I know many of these aren't going to be health and wellness, but just want to give some insight out there. The Breakfast Club, The Read, um, the 85 South show, Elevation with Stephen Furtick. You have the Michelle Obama podcast and Oprah's Super Soul podcast. Pretty Basic with Alicia Marie. So those are some of the top shows that are best at appealing to Black women in our rankers and our data that we have in our other product. So did my best to answer that question, but I think that's going to have to wait another year to get specific into the self-care side of things.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are all celebrity podcasts, and so there's a reason why that has a mass appeal. And so us being a resource and a community for independent Black podcasters, we all get why those numbers are up and why they're top. It will be important, for our community to understand what moves people to listen to independent podcasts.
Yeah, and although the independent and celebrity podcasts aren't mutually exclusive when it comes to listeners, right? There are people who are consuming both, and a lot of the time, what we see is that the precise knowledge and information that's provided in the independent podcast is very important in terms of the qualitative work that we do. We get a lot of that. So one of the things that independent podcasters can do is focus on that precise knowledge and educational material that you won't find in a big podcast like that. But I think you can also look to some of these more successful podcasts, some of these big celebrity appeals for the type of content that they do, right? In case you want to learn and almost emulate it maybe, or just see what works and what it's currently attracting these listeners to the medium.
Yeah, absolutely. Just Corey, real quick, are you looking at the chat?
Yes, I am.
That's where you're asking the questions from?
No, I'm getting from the people who actually submitted
okay
a form when we were asking them to. I'll get to the ones in the comments. That's
all right. I just wanted to make sure that we were looking at that as well.
Yeah,
see some good questions in there.
I was just looking at some of those questions. I was like, I don't know if we're gonna have a chance to get to all of that. But we'll try to figure out a way to get some of those questions answered. I guess maybe Gabriel or someone on your team can answer them down the road, and we can publish them so that we can get everyone's questions answered.
Yeah, that would be awesome. So I have a question about the recency of the increase, right, in Black listenership. So this is again from the report, many Black monthly podcast listeners have begun listening to podcasts recently. 48% have been listening to podcasts less than a year, and 27% have been listening less than 6 months. So I know that, we do our part to increase active podcasts in the global market and sustainability and supporting resources around marketing and identifying audiences. But what, in your perspective, has, contributed to that recent increase in listenership?
So I think when we look at previous data, you see that Black listeners and Latino listeners were behind in listenership. If you look at 2019, 2018, and before then, I think part of it is certainly the content, right, that is now available. It has increased in recent years, and also how the medium has entered the cultural center of the United States, right? It wasn't long ago, 2019, that the majority of the country had ever tried a podcast. So that was a big milestone for the medium. But when it comes to Black listeners, they're younger listeners compared to the general population. So the content, I think, is a factor, but also the younger listeners being on streaming platforms like Spotify, like Apple Podcasts, like YouTube, right, that in recent years have promoted this idea of podcasting to their audience. So that's, I think, another factor, the fact that they've already been they're a part of this platform, right, that is going to one way or another pass them, and they're going to run into it on those YouTube platforms, Spotify, and streaming platforms that they use. So just the makeup of how young they are is another push and another driver behind that.
Interesting. Okay. Corey, any questions?
And I also, one more thing I do want to add is, I think it's also the content that you can access on general traditional media like radio isn't as diverse as it is on podcasts. I think there's a lot more content And since podcast medium doesn't have any gatekeepers, it allows for creators like you guys and in your community to be able to start whatever type of show that you want to, and allow creators to access on-demand content that they can listen to whenever they want to, right? Uh, and the fact that these younger populations of Black Americans are starting this content has got to be another driver behind that increase in listenership.
Okay.
So the last question, submitted question, and then we'll get to the questions in the comment section. As many as we can, as time will allow. But this is from Michael S. Parker. He asks, how can we help to keep our returning listeners engaged in our podcast? So I guess I'll reframe that a little bit to saying, how can we use the data on this report to help podcasters with keeping engagement with their listeners?
Yeah. So I think one of the revealing stats that we put out this year was why listeners stopped listening to a podcast that they used to consume regularly. And that's in the report. But some of the reasons, the top reason, for example, they didn't have any time. Taking a look at that right now, they didn't have any time to consume the podcast anymore. They got tired of it. Those are things that are going to naturally happen. But I think one of the more revealing things was that the show stopped producing new episodes. And 20% of Black listeners say they forgot about the show in between seasons. And something I think I will always advocate for, if you want to retain listeners, is to have frequent episode publishing and to stay connected with this community. So make sure they don't forget about you. Kind of have to step in the shoes of the audience and tell yourself what they're seeing on some of these directories. And when they're consuming podcasts, they're being saturated with a bunch of other content, right? And if the best thing to do is, if you can form a habit, if you have content that does well, or if you have the opportunity to do so, publish an episode, or try to do as much as possible so a listener can wake up in the morning and listen to you right away. And if that's not it, maybe at nighttime, because we understand in our research that podcast listening occurs most often at home, and it also has a big spike in the morning during morning commutes, and even after that. But when people are getting ready, when people are doing chores, you kind of want to get in the mind of the listener and hope that, whenever they come home for dinner, they're going to listen to your podcast, and they're going to get in a habit of doing that. So it's going to be important for you to publish frequently, and not stop in between seasons. If you don't have content that you can put out, maybe put out a previous episode, maybe collaborate with other podcasts to put content on your feed that is relevant, because we know that listeners can smell out content that's not relevant, right, to their feed, to their favorite podcast. But I think it's still important if you can find something that matches your content well.
Yeah, I like that. I like that advice, and definitely, we definitely want to encourage people to burn out and grind this until they can't. It just becomes too much. But being able to repurpose and or collaborate, which is something that we're big on, with other creatives and other podcasts, is a really great idea. I see some questions here, like from Walter Gaynor, Boss Locks, but also a member of BPA. Is this report shared with corporations and ad networks, or do you kind of see the onus on the creatives who receive this information, or companies or what have you, to share this out?
Yeah, so the onus is on people to do what they want with the report. We publish it, and we put it out for free. But from what I know, yes, there's a lot of agencies, there's a lot of networks, there's a lot of independent creators that sign up and subscribe to see when the Black Podcast Listener Report is coming out. Mindshare itself is a ad buying agency, right? That they don't work in just podcasts, but they work in the in other mediums as well. They see a lot of value that comes out of this data, and they want to be one of the leaders in the space, and that's why they help fund it.
Okay.
I was going to actually ask that, and also ask, tied in with Shamiko's, with how is the report distributed? Like, what channels do you guys distribute the report? Is it just mainly through your website, or how do you go?
Yeah, mainly through the website. So through the webinar, when we first publish it, SXM, they do a blog post, and they share it with their clients, ad buyers, brands, to advocate for the Black audience, and the Black creators on the SXM network. And yeah, other than that, people can share free willing, and they can share however they wanted to. So
Oh,
we don't really do much else other than
I'm
just
sorry,
publish
she
it.
corrected me. It's not the report itself, the data collection mechanism. How's that distributed?
Oh, okay. When we recruit, yeah, we work with a field partner that they recruit all of our surveys online. So they have a panel, nationally representative panel of Black Americans in the United States that takes surveys. So this is what allows us to collect a random sample of people in the Northeast, in the West, in the South, of different age groups, of different genders, and of that immigrant population, right? Although we don't have a strong enough sample size to look at them within a small group yet. Hopefully, something for the future. But yes, it's mostly through enterprise database of different Black Americans.
Okay.
Cool.
KDL asks, since most podcast hosting platforms don't identify the racial identities of your listeners, how would you suggest going about finding out how diverse your audience is?
So can you repeat that? So that the
Yeah.
podcast listeners,
Since most podcast hosting platforms don't
okay.
identify the racial identities of your listeners, how would you suggest going about finding out how diverse your audience is?
Yeah, that's good. That's a tough one, and that's something that's come up before. One way that you can certainly go about it is, and this is something that's going to be very hard for some people to do, and maybe some very easy for some people to do. But we see, and I think Media pointed this out from SXM Media in the report, that video podcast listening has increased, right, throughout the since 2021, and that's one way that we're seeing and understanding that listeners are being able to identify who is speaking on this podcast, who is what racial group they're representing. And so that's one way to go about it, right? Just start a podcast with video, and if you don't do video, maybe it just involves clips, right, for promotional reasons. You can freely identify, right, on the podcast that you're listening to, if you think that benefits you, which a lot of the data in the report says it does, when you are able to identify as Black, or if your listeners are able to identify you as a Black host, they're going to be more likely to listen. They're going to be have these attitudes that they say that the Black that host of the podcast is important to them when it comes to being Black, and that they're more likely to engage with the brand. But in terms of audio, we know that other listeners are able to sometimes tell culturally, right, in terms of the content that they're talking about, maybe by accent, maybe by, if someone hears you with like a Brooklyn accent or something like that, they understand you're from Brooklyn, right? Or if you have an English accent, they understand you're from England. We have listeners that are able to tell that way. But I think the most, if you want to assure yourself, if you want to identify as Black or whatever group that you represent on the podcast, I think go ahead. That's a good way to do it.
Yeah, we have Steve Worthy of Podcast Live. He said he conducted his own survey to get a better demographic and psychographic, which is I think you can start somewhere like with a Google Forms or some kind of form data collection type form service, and just ask those questions. Just ask your listenership to participate in those to help you get some of that data as well, right?
Oh, yes. If you want to capture the audience demographic of your listeners, yeah, you can certainly do that. We also have one of the top, like the top 25 questions to ask on a survey, on a listener survey on edisonresearch.com. You can probably just Google that. And you can take it from us, the questions that we've been asking it, and how to ask them in a very clear way so that respondents aren't confused and that your data is solid.
That's
Okay.
a great resource. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great resource. So you guys heard it. You can go to Edison Research and download those top 25 questions that you can ask on their website. Uh, Next question I have is from Steve Worthy at Podcasters Live. He says the data mentioned a stronger focus on video/live streaming podcasts. Would you suggest podcasters implement a video component based off
Yeah,
the data?
it depends on your podcast. Something like for a narrative podcast to do a video and have a well produced podcast about your investigative process in discovering the who the suspect was in this murder. It's going to be tough to do, right? That's like basically Dateline NBC right there. But when it comes to like those conversational podcasts, we've seen a lot of those are very popular. When people are just chatting on a microphone, interviewing people. And I would recommend to consider it. It's not going to be for everyone. It definitely changes the atmosphere and the vibe of the audience. I know, speaking to different podcasters in the industry, that adding cameras changes the atmosphere of the interview that's going on or the podcast recording that's going on. So be mindful of that. But we know that many podcasters are using it for promotional reasons. That's one of the biggest ways that I've heard podcasters use it for. So short clips on social media like TikTok, YouTube Shorts, to promote your podcast and get it in front of more eyes.
Okay.
There's a question from James Hicks, who just learned about us 10 minutes before the started. So welcome, James. But he's curious to know if there's more attraction to interview style sessions or one-to-many. I'm not really familiar with that term. I assume it means one person talking or many people
Like,
talking.
yeah, like a panel discussion.
A panel, okay. One-to-many, analyzing and providing opinion on the subject matter. So I'll read it again. He's curious to know if there's more attraction to interview style sessions or one-to-many, analyzing and providing opinion on a subject matter.
We don't have a lot of data on that type of information, but what I can tell you is that many of the shows that are popular among this audience are that just one-to-one interview style, maybe one to two people. You don't see too many that are panel, right, podcasts. But that's not to say that it's not a content that will be popular in the future. It's just something that's not popular now.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in that space though, like, and that might be another conversation. I think it's easier to do one to many than it is to do a solo. It takes a little bit more time to really do your research on a one-to-one basis versus having a bunch of different people with different opinions, just giving it as you just ask questions. So
Oh, okay. Yeah. When you're comparing like just the solo, yes, we see. I thought he was talking about one to one and then a panel.
well, he said interview, so I'm assuming it's one-to-one.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think we see more of that, the one to one shows, and not so much the panel with a bunch of people. If that's what he's referring to, if that's what you meant, Talib, by one to
Yeah,
many.
it says Shamiko is helping me out here, and it says a solo show versus interview.
Oh, solo show versus interview. Yeah, we see the interview shows are. I think you see a lot more of that, but there are a lot of solo shows that I think are popular too, especially in the independent area.
Okay. I have a separate question, and you mentioned like promotion and shorts and videos, stuff like that. And so I'll read the line again. Social media is a big source of podcast discovery. 36% of Black monthly podcast listeners discover podcasts on social media when they begin listening, up from 31% in 2021. So what I find that's interesting about this is that you'll hear from a lot of podcast strategists and coaches that will say loudly that podcasters won't get much traction from social media, and or not, that promoting on social media is like going into an echo chamber. Your audience isn't there. But this kind of says opposite, and so it's data, and that's important, versus opinion. So what do you have to say about that according to this data point?
Yeah, a lot of the time, and you kind of have to ask some of these coaches, or what they're why they're forming that opinion. And many of the time is there people are using hard, or not to say hard, digital data to see if there's a conversion right from their social media account to their podcast. They're using, maybe like a link that's on TikTok, or Facebook, or whatever it is, Twitter, to see if people clicked on their show after seeing that tweet. But people don't understand the value of the social media's power to influence the awareness of your show. Uh, it's not every time that people are gonna see your tweet and go to the show right away. They might know about your show, see another tweet later on, and maybe decide to look it up. So some of the times that uh, some of those opinions are relied upon using that sort of data. What's great about this report is that it's survey based. So we're asking these listeners what influences them the most. So it's coming from the minds, and we're understanding how to get this content in front of their ears. And they're telling us that it is social media. So some of the times we have incomplete information, and we form that opinion, but social media is definitely a valuable part of promoting your podcast.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We have a question from Jay, the CEO. Does Edison Research, do you have an API to access data? Do you have something that can be for receiving and submitting data?
That's something that we've thought about, and I'm happy to have this conversation with the person that asked the question. What type of information would you like to see in an API? Whether that includes all the free information that we put out there. But it's something that we're thinking about. It's not something that we have yet. I would love to have an API that gives you access to everything in the Black Podcast Listener Report, everything in the Latino Podcast Listener Report, everything that we put out free to the public. So it gives people easy access to use it however they please.
I would love that too. It would be able to pull that information into other resources as well, like apps and websites and stuff. So I definitely can connect you with Jay on that to discuss that and answer those questions.
Cool.
I think we're kind of doing really good. Do you have a question, Talib?
Yeah. I have a question, and it might be just the way my brain computes things. So I need you to break it down for me a little bit more. Again, I'll read it. 43% of Black 18 plus population in the U.S. has listened to a podcast in the last month. That percentage is larger than the number of the overall 18 plus population that reports listening to a podcast in the last month, 38%. So that line stood out to me because, again, the way my brain computes, it's hard for me to understand it. So I think I get it, but it was added for a reason. And so can you further break down what that actually means?
The fact that they're listening more than the general population?
Yeah, more. That says the percentage is larger than the number of the overall 18 plus population that reports listening to a podcast in the last month. What does that mean?
It just means that listeners, when you isolate Black Americans as a group, they're more likely to listen to a podcast in the last month than the overall audience, including Black listeners. But if you look at the overall total population um, in the United States, 38% of those people have listened to a podcast in the last month. When you just put a microscope on Black listeners, we look and we see that 43% of that group have listened to a podcast in the last month. So they're more likely to listen to podcasts monthly.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. I read that like 18 times and was still like, okay.
Is
Yeah,
there
and that's a big one, and that's an important one.
Is there a reason in the report in the collection? Is there a reason for that where they're most likely listen monthly versus weekly?
It allows us to look at the frequent listeners and the people who listen monthly. It's just something that allows us to capture and it's also an easy question. Did you listen to a podcast in the last month, right? And people can most of the time encompass in their head what they did in the last month. And this is a survey, so of course some might not remember, but it's an estimate. But that's, I think, one of the more simpler questions to answer. Did you listen to a podcast in the last month? And then did you listen to a podcast in the last week?
Okay.
And it's a way of measuring, the mediums, the media that we've been measuring since the 90s. We also know that we also know what type of social media platforms use in the last month. We also know if people listen to audiobooks in the last month. We also know people listen to radio in the last month, and just kind of capture this. We understand that monthly listeners are also a little bit different than weekly listeners. The weekly listeners obviously spend more time with podcasts. They're more likely to be men. And then you can also look at daily listeners if you listen to a podcast in the last week, but that's a different study.
Okay. I have a question. I've been, out here in Queens, I've been connecting with more Black-owned businesses, and I'm trying to figure out the bridge. And if you've had conversations with me, this is something that's important to me. How can podcasters utilize this report or what? Better question: what sections of this report should podcasters focus on if they want to use this report to help them get Black-owned businesses to advertise or sponsor their podcast?
Monetization section, definitely, hands down. And we put out a lot of information out there, more than what you saw in the webinar. If you haven't taken a look at the full report, you only saw the webinar, please take a look at the full report because it's going to have a lot of information. So we have information on how likely they are to engage with the product, right? If they've ever purchased a product after listening to an ad on a podcast. And we also have information on what type of sponsorships or advertisements they find favorable, right? Such as sponsorship messages. We also ask information about messages from products or sponsors read live by the host, personalized or ad lib discussions, different types of sponsorship advertisements. But we also collected attitudinal information about if they disagree or don't disagree with sponsorships messages on podcasts are more interesting if it is being read by a Black announcer. And we know that about 40% say they strongly or somewhat agree with that statement. So that section is definitely key to use if you want to convince Black-owned businesses or different groups and show them the power, right, of Black hosts and creators in the space.
Yeah. I want to either clear something up or confirm it. Walter Gaynor wrote, I didn't realize that audiobook and radio info was in the report too.
No, so it's not in this report. I was just referring to the general research that we do at Edison. If you do want that type of information, this would be a good time to promote the Infinite Dial, which is the standard, right, in some of the media research that's out there. We're actually publishing that this Thursday. My colleague Megan Lazovic is teaming up with our partner Wondery, and they're going to release what has lately become the status of report of the podcasting industry and other industries. So check that out. There'll be some on Black listeners as well. So yeah, take a look at that. That'll have information on audiobook, radio, online radio consumption, different social media. So it's all free. So you can definitely download that. Um, yes. So to answer your question now, can I also answer? So Shamiko Reed asks, if 1,000 Americans were polled, 380 listened. If 100 of those were Black, 43 of them listened. Um, so I guess he's asking. So everyone in this report. Oh, sorry, Shamiko. She's also asking. So the sample size, just to clear that up, is 2,500. So 2,500 Black respondents, Black Americans. Everyone in the study identified as Black or African American. So of those 2,500, 1,500 were podcast listeners. So that allowed us to cut deep and look at female listeners versus male listeners, listeners of different age groups.
Yeah, I think she was working to support me in my inability to understand that sentence as well. So I think that was what that was coming from. But it's important to reiterate that data pool size. So yeah, thank you. I mean, I think this was great information.
I have one more question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Then I guess we can wrap up, Talib, because we're getting close to the 1 o'clock to 1 hour mark. I know I've asked you in the past, and I know this is like a random group that you guys work with. But one of the sentiments I get in talking to people is how can we be a part of this process? How can we as Black podcasters can do to help make this a better report for everybody involved? What part of the process can we be involved in, or how can we offer suggestions and help to make this a better, every year going in, make it better and better, because you have different questions and needs and stuff.
Yeah. So last year we had a Black Podcast Listener Report networking event. We hope to do something similar this year, or at least have some sort of event. This is a great community here, and you can stay in touch with me. Excuse me, and send suggestions my way, Corey, like you've done in the past. We didn't talk about this in the webinar, but we released stuff like information on LGBT listeners, how many identified as LGBT in the full report. We did some more comparisons between what we had of what was possible between the general audience and Black listeners, because of you, Corey, right? Because of your suggestion to do a little bit more of that. So we take into account, we have a master list of all these recommendations, take the input into account, and we try to see what's possible when we do conduct the research. So yes, your input is definitely looked over. But I can also say, feel free to share, write about the report if you want. Use it as your own to advocate. There's a lot of perspectives that I don't understand as a researcher that you do as an independent podcaster that you can provide and I can't. So write on Medium, have a webinar about it. Feel free to invite us. We're happy to attend. But share it with your friends and talk about the report on your own. So that also helps put a spotlight on it.
Okay. Last one is Steve, I guess in relation to what we're talking about. He says, can we get a link to share with our listeners when you are starting the survey?
Sure, yeah. I can make like we don't have a date for the next report yet. But we can certainly, if you start like a Google sheet or something, feel free to pass that around, Corey.
Okay. All right.
And I'll keep you updated too when we know when the next survey is starting. I think we did that. We also did that last, right, in August. I sent you an email.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess with that being said, Talib, thank you for being here, Gabriel. And thank you for your time and answering these questions from our audience and our members and our community overall. I really appreciate this. Talib, you have any final words or anything?
No, just thank you so much. And thank you to our community for showing up and asking your questions and engaging. Gabriel, really appreciate your time with us today. and we'll just continue to build on this and continue to engage with you as well to make sure we have the latest and the best data that supports us as podcasters. So appreciate your time, and Corey, thank you as well.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate you guys. I'm looking forward to see what the community does with it.
And if somebody wanted to reach out to you and give some suggestions and stuff like that, they can reach out to you on like Twitter, LinkedIn as well, right?
Correct. Yeah. I've been off of it recently. I need to get better at social media. So if I started again today, actually. So it was ironic. It's just a coincidence that Corey messaged me about this earlier this morning. But yes, you can reach me on there, and I will respond. It might be slow a little bit, but I'll get an answer to you.
All right. And if you guys are interested in learning more about Afros and Audio and connecting with Talib, you can definitely check him out, afrosandaudio.com. Make sure you go to the website, learn more about the 5th annual podcast festival coming up this year. There's a lot of information you can reserve your spot, so make sure you go do that as soon as possible. So thank you, Talib, for helping to orchestrate and put this together. And of course, if you're more interested in learning about the Black Podcast Association, you can go to blackpodcastassociation.com. You can also follow us on IG and Twitter as well. But I really appreciate everyone participating. Thank you to the audience for your questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted. It was a great conversation. I think this is the first of many. I think we need to do more things like this to show the value of these reports, not only for ourselves, but for the industry as a whole as well. So thank you again, Gabriel, for being here. Thank you to Edison Research. And I guess we'll talk to everyone soon, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day. Oh, and if there weren't any questions, Gabriel, if there weren't any questions answered, I will send you an email. Maybe you can answer them, and I'll make sure I put them in our newsletter at blackpodnews.com. I got to plug that too. blackpodnews.com. So we'll do a write-up on that as well. But thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks.